"You're fired effective immediately," the manager said. And in that exact second, Emma Carter realized kindness had just cost her everything. The words didn't echo in a dramatic way. They landed quietly, like something heavy dropping inside her chest while the glass doors of Horizon Accounting still swung behind her, letting in the cold Manhattan morning air. Emma stood there holding a thin folder of client notes she had prepared the night before, her hands still slightly trembling, not from fear, but from exhaustion that had become normal over the last 2 years. At 29, she had learned how to survive on coffee, 2 hours of sleep, and the kind of hope that never fully lasted the whole day. She had a 6-year-old son waiting for her at home with a low fever and a stack of unpaid bills sitting on a kitchen counter that never seemed to get smaller. The city around her kept moving, taxis honking, people rushing past in expensive coats, no one noticing the woman who had just lost her only steady income. 3 hours earlier, Emma had been walking toward this same building when she saw an older man struggling at a busy crosswalk near Fifth Avenue, cars flowing too fast for him to step forward safely. No one stopped. People looked away, checked their watches, adjusted their headphones, all pretending not to see. Emma had stopped. She remembered thinking she would be late again, that her supervisor would glare at her, that maybe she couldn't afford another mistake, but the man's hesitation felt heavier than her fear of consequences. So she stepped off the curb, placed herself gently beside him, and guided him across with a steady voice and a patient smile, taking less than a minute that felt longer than it should have. The man had thanked her softly, almost embarrassed, and she had nodded before rushing away, already checking the time on her cracked phone screen. Now, standing outside the building where she had worked for almost 3 years, that single minute felt like a decision that had rewritten her entire life. Inside, she had been called into the manager's office without warning, told there had been complaints about punctuality, about lack of discipline, about not meeting expectations, words that sounded clean but felt anything but fair. There was no discussion, no chance to explain the crosswalk, no space for context. Just a signature request, a final paycheck notice, and the polite suggestion that she focus on other opportunities. Emma walked down the steps slowly, each one heavier than the last, until she reached the sidewalk where the wind felt sharper than before. She looked at the city skyline, tall and indifferent, reflecting sunlight off glass towers that didn't care who lost or won at ground level. In her bag, her phone buzzed again, a reminder from the daycare about tuition due at the end of the week. And for a moment she just stood there, breathing in shallow silence, wondering how something so small, so human, could turn into something so expensive. She didn't know that across the street, inside a black sedan parked half-hidden behind a row of taxis, a man in a tailored suit had just witnessed everything, including the moment she chose kindness over caution and the moment the world decided to punish her for it. Emma Carter stood on the sidewalk for a long moment after leaving the building, the cold air brushing against her face like a reminder that nothing around her would slow down just because her world had just collapsed. People passed her without noticing, phones in hand, coffee cups steaming, each of them moving with a certainty she no longer felt. She slowly stepped away from the entrance, her shoes clicking softly against the pavement, each step feeling less like walking and more like drifting through something unfamiliar. Her phone buzzed again inside her worn handbag, another notification about her son's daycare payment, but she did not look at it right away. Instead, she exhaled and forced herself to keep moving, because standing still would mean thinking too deeply about what had just happened. 2 blocks away, she finally stopped near a small cafe, pressing a hand lightly against the brick wall as if it could steady her. She had done everything right, at least she thought she had. She showed up early most days, stayed late when asked, covered shifts without complaint, and never once refused overtime even when it meant missing bedtime stories with her son. And yet, a single moment, a single decision to help someone cross a street had been enough to undo all of it. She opened her phone and stared at the screen, her contact list suddenly feeling smaller than it had ever felt before. There was no one she could call who would fix this, no manager to reverse the decision, no system to appeal to that would understand she had simply chosen to be human for less than a minute. Across the street, in a black sedan that blended into the flow of traffic, William Harris watched her quietly. He was not a man who spent much time on the street level of New York anymore. His life existed in boardrooms, private elevators, and glass offices that looked down on everything else. But today, something had pulled him out of routine, something subtle and hard to define. He had been on his way to a meeting when he noticed his father, Richard Harris, stepping slowly into a crosswalk, clearly struggling with the pace of the city. William had asked the driver to slow down, and that was when he saw her. A young woman, stepping out of the crowd without hesitation, guiding his father safely across, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. There had been no performance in her actions, no awareness of being watched, only quiet attention and patience in a place where neither was common. His father had smiled afterward, speaking briefly with her before she rushed away, disappearing into the crowd without waiting for recognition or thanks. William had not said anything at the time, but something about the moment stayed with him longer than expected. Now, as he watched her stand alone on the sidewalk, he felt a growing curiosity that did not match his usual way of thinking. He had built companies, negotiated contracts worth millions of dollars, and made decisions that affected thousands of employees. Yet none of those experiences had the same quiet weight as what he had just witnessed. He opened a secure message on his phone and sent a short instruction to his assistant, asking for everything available about a woman named Emma Carter who had recently worked at Horizon Accounting. There was no urgency in his tone, no emotional language, only a simple request that would normally take minutes to fulfill. Inside the cafe, Emma sat near the window but did not order anything. She watched the world continue outside as if nothing had shifted, as if her life had not just changed direction without warning. She thought about her son again, about his small voice asking her yesterday if she would be home early, and she closed her eyes for a moment, holding that memory close like something fragile. She told herself she would figure it out, that she always had before, but for the first time, the words did not fully convince her. Outside, William Harris remained in the car, still watching, still thinking, unaware that the small decision he was about to make would bring his world and hers onto a collision path neither of them was prepared for. William Harris remained in the back seat of the black sedan long after the traffic light turned green, his attention still fixed on the woman across the street who sat alone inside the small cafe window. New York City continued its relentless rhythm around them, horns echoing in the distance, pedestrians weaving through intersections, but his focus stayed on her as if the rest of the world had been muted. He checked the brief message from his assistant once more, confirming that a preliminary search had already been initiated on Emma Carter, former employee of Horizon Accounting. There was nothing unusual about the request itself. He had ordered background checks on hundreds of employees before, usually tied to performance reviews or internal restructuring. But this felt different, though he could not yet explain why. Inside the cafe, Emma finally ordered a simple black coffee she did not really want, just to avoid sitting without anything in front of her. Her hands wrapped around the warm cup as if she needed the heat to steady her thoughts. She told herself she should start planning immediately, maybe call a staffing agency, maybe update her resume, maybe figure out how to explain to her son why things would be tighter this month. But every thought kept circling back to the same moment, the manager's voice, the finality of the words, and the strange emptiness that followed after she walked out of the building. Outside, William stepped out of the sedan for the first time, adjusting his coat as he crossed the street with calm precision. He was not dressed to stand out, but people still noticed him in subtle ways, the kind of presence that made others instinctively step aside. He stopped near the cafe entrance, but did not go in immediately. Instead, he looked through the glass, studying Emma as she stared down at her cup, unaware she was being observed. Something about her posture caught his attention, not weakness, but restraint, like someone holding together a life that required constant effort to maintain. He pushed the door open and entered. The small bell above it chimed softly, breaking the quiet rhythm inside the cafe. Emma looked up briefly, expecting nothing more than another customer, then quickly looked away again. William ordered nothing at first. He stood near the counter for a moment, then slowly walked toward the window seat adjacent to hers, choosing a position that was close enough to see her, but not intrusive. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm, measured, without the authority people usually associated with him in business settings. He asked if the seat across from her was taken. Emma hesitated, then shook her head slightly, unsure why anyone would choose to sit there when the entire cafe was mostly empty. William sat down, placing his hands lightly on the table, his eyes briefly scanning her face in a way that was not judgmental, only observant. For a few seconds, neither of them spoke. Outside, traffic moved as usual, but inside the cafe time felt slightly disconnected from everything else. Finally, William asked a simple question, whether she had worked at Horizon Accounting. Emma looked up sharply, immediately guarded, her instincts shifting into caution. She asked how he knew that. William did not answer directly. Instead, he explained that he had seen her earlier that day, that he had been nearby when she helped his father cross the street safely. The words made Emma pause, confusion flickering across her expression. She had not expected that moment to be connected to anything beyond itself. William continued, his tone steady, saying that his father had mentioned her kindness and that he wanted to understand the situation more clearly. Emma lowered her gaze again, her fingers tightening slightly around the coffee cup. She explained quietly what had happened at work, how she had been let go without warning, how there had been no space to explain, how the decision had felt final before she even understood it was happening. She did not embellish, did not dramatize, only stated facts in a tired voice that carried more weight than emotion. William listened without interruption. It was not the kind of story he was unfamiliar with in abstract terms, but hearing it directly from someone affected gave it a different shape. When she finished speaking, there was a brief silence between them. William leaned back slightly, as if processing more than just the words. He asked one final question, whether she would be willing to speak with him again after today, not as a formality, but as something he needed to follow through on. Emma did not answer immediately. She looked out the window instead, watching a group of people laughing as they passed by, their lives continuing without interruption. Then she turned back to him and said she did not know what she could possibly offer him in a conversation. William replied that sometimes it was not about offering anything, but about being seen accurately. For the first time that day, Emma did not have a response. She simply looked at him, trying to understand why a stranger would care enough to sit down, ask questions, and listen when the rest of the world had already moved on. The silence between Emma Carter and William Harris stretched longer than either of them seemed to expect, not uncomfortable, but heavy in a way that made every small sound inside the cafe feel more noticeable. The distant hiss of the espresso machine, the soft clink of ceramic cups, and the muted conversations from other tables all formed a background that neither of them fully registered. Emma finally shifted in her seat, her fingers loosening slightly around the coffee cup, as if realizing she had been holding onto it too tightly. She glanced at William again, studying him more carefully now, noticing details she had missed earlier, the calm precision in his posture, the understated quality of his clothing, the kind of presence that suggested influence without needing to announce it. He, in turn, remained patient, giving her space without pressing further, which was something she was not used to in conversations that felt important. After a moment, William spoke again, this time asking if she had any plans for the rest of the day. Emma almost laughed at the question, but it came out more like a quiet breath. She said she had none, at least none that mattered anymore. The honesty of it surprised her slightly, as if saying it aloud made it more real than she had been willing to admit internally. William nodded slowly, as though he understood more than the words themselves. He explained that his father had mentioned her briefly, describing a woman who helped him across a busy intersection without hesitation, and that he wanted to make sure she was properly acknowledged. Emma looked down at her hands again, uncomfortable with the idea of being acknowledged for something she considered ordinary. She said quietly that anyone would have done the same thing. William did not immediately agree or disagree. Instead, he leaned forward slightly and asked her what had happened at work that led her to leave the building earlier that day. Emma hesitated for a moment, then repeated the story again, this time more slowly, as if each word carried its own weight. She spoke about arriving on time most days, about working through lunch breaks, about staying late when files needed to be finished. Then she described the morning, the man in the crosswalk, the decision to help, and the moment she was called into the office afterward. There was no anger in her voice, only a kind of exhausted acceptance, as if she had already processed the injustice but had not yet figured out what came next. William listened without interruption, his expression unchanged, but his attention fully fixed on her. When she finished, he asked if she had received any formal warning. Before being dismissed, Emma shook her head. There had been nothing, no written notice, no prior discussion. Only a brief explanation about performance expectations that did not feel connected to reality. William leaned back slightly, his gaze shifting toward the window, as if considering something beyond the cafe walls. He asked her if she had ever been involved in any disciplinary issues before that day. Emma shook her head again, more firmly this time. She had not. The answer seemed to settle something in his mind, though he did not reveal what. After a short pause, he asked if she would be willing to meet him again later that evening, not in the cafe, but at a more private location where they could talk without distraction. Emma hesitated, her instinct immediately cautious. She had learned to be careful with unexpected offers, especially from people she did not fully understand. But there was something in William's tone that did not feel transactional or rehearsed. It was measured, but not manipulative. After a long moment, she agreed, mostly because she could not see what she had to lose that had not already been taken from her earlier that day. William nodded once, then stood up, placing a card gently on the table in front of her without insisting she take it. He told her the address was on it, and that if she decided not to come, there would be no consequences or follow-up. Then he left the cafe the same way he had entered, calm and unhurried, disappearing into the movement of the city outside. Emma remained seated for several minutes after he was gone, staring at the small card on the table without touching it. The letters on it were simple, clean, and unfamiliar, but they carried a weight she did not yet understand. Outside the window, New York continued as if nothing had changed, but inside the cafe, Emma felt as though something had already begun shifting in a direction she could no longer avoid. Emma Carter sat alone in her small apartment that evening, the same apartment that suddenly felt quieter than it had ever felt before. The refrigerator hummed in the background, and her son's toys were scattered across the living room floor, untouched since. She had returned home earlier that afternoon. He was asleep now, his breathing steady, his fever finally easing after medication she could barely afford. Emma sat at the edge of the worn couch, staring at the simple card resting on the coffee table. She had not touched it since the cafe, as if doing so would make the decision more real than she was ready for. The address printed on it pointed to a location she had only seen from a distance before, a corporate building in the heart of Manhattan known for glass walls and silent security doors. She told herself she did not have to go. She could ignore it, move on, start over somewhere smaller, somewhere less complicated. But every time she tried to dismiss it, her thoughts returned to the moment earlier that day, the calm way William Harris had listened, the absence of judgment in his voice, and the strange certainty that he had not spoken to her out of curiosity alone. At exactly 7:45 in the evening, Emma found herself standing outside the building anyway, her coat pulled tightly around her, her breath visible in the cold air. The entrance was brighter than she expected, the lights inside soft but deliberate, reflecting off polished floors that made everything feel distant and controlled. A security guard greeted her politely, already expecting her name, which made her pause for a brief moment before she confirmed it. She was guided inside without difficulty, taken past reception and toward an elevator that required access clearance she did not possess, yet it was already prepared for her arrival. The ride upward was silent except for a soft chime at each floor, and Emma found herself gripping the strap of her bag more tightly as the numbers increased. When the doors opened, she was greeted not by a busy office floor, but a quiet corridor that led to a single set of double doors at the end. A woman in professional attire stood waiting, introducing herself briefly and guiding Emma forward with calm efficiency. The doors opened into a private conference room with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city skyline, where William Harris stood alone, facing the glass, his hands loosely resting behind his back. He turned when she entered, acknowledging her presence with a simple nod before gesturing for her to sit. Emma did so carefully, still unsure of what exactly she had walked into. The room felt different from the cafe, more formal, more deliberate, but not intimidating in the way she expected. William took a seat across from her, placing a thin folder on the table between them without opening it immediately. For a moment, neither of them spoke, as if the silence itself was part of the conversation. Then William finally said that he had reviewed what happened earlier that day, including internal records from Horizon Accounting and witness statements regarding her dismissal. Emma felt her stomach tighten slightly, not from fear, but from confusion. She had not expected anyone to look further into it. William continued calmly, explaining that there was no documented performance issue prior to her termination, and that the decision appeared to have been made abruptly, without standard procedure. Emma stared at him, unsure how to respond, because hearing it confirmed by someone else made it feel even more unreal. She explained again that she had not done anything wrong, that she had simply helped someone in need, and that she still did not understand why that had been enough to cost her job. William listened carefully, his expression steady but increasingly focused, as if connecting pieces of information that had not aligned before. After a pause, he asked her to describe the man she had helped that morning. Emma thought for a moment, recalling the details, the slow movement, the familiar hesitation in his steps, the quiet gratitude afterward. As she described him, William's expression shifted slightly, subtle recognition forming behind his composed exterior. He reached for his phone and made a brief call without explaining, asking only for confirmation about his father's morning schedule and whereabouts. When he ended the call, he looked back at Emma with a different kind of attention, one that carried both clarity and concern. He told her that the man she had helped was indeed his father, Richard Harris, and that what she had done was not only noticed but also deeply appreciated. Emma lowered her gaze, suddenly overwhelmed by the simplicity of it, because in her mind it had never been about recognition. It had been a small human choice made in a busy street. William then said something that made her look up again. He told her that people often reveal their character in moments when there is nothing to gain, and that what she had done that morning had already changed how he viewed more than just her situation. Emma did not fully understand what he meant, but she could sense that the conversation was shifting towards something larger than a single job or a single day. Outside the windows, the city lights continued to rise across the skyline, steady and indifferent, while inside the room, a decision was beginning to form that would quietly alter the direction of both of their lives. The conference room remained quiet after Emma Carter finished speaking, the kind of silence that did not feel empty, but instead felt full of unspoken conclusions. William Harris sat across from her, his attention no longer on the city outside the glass windows, but fully centered on the situation unfolding in front of him. He had already confirmed what he needed to know. His father had been there that morning, and the woman sitting across from him had acted without hesitation or expectation. That combination alone was rare in his experience, rarer than most people would assume in a city like New York, where everything was usually calculated in advance. Emma shifted slightly in her chair, uncertain whether she was expected to say more or simply wait. William finally spoke, his tone steady but more deliberate than before. He told her that situations like hers were not common in his company network, especially when termination decisions appeared inconsistent with internal policy. Emma listened, unsure whether that was meant as reassurance or observation. He continued by explaining that Horizon Accounting was indirectly connected to one of his subsidiary partners, which meant he had access to internal review channels that most employees would never be aware of. Emma's expression tightened slightly, not from anger, but from discomfort at how far removed all of this felt from her actual life. She had not asked for any of it. William opened the folder on the table for the first time, sliding a few printed pages forward. They contained summarized records, timestamps, and brief statements from supervisors involved in her dismissal. Everything appeared procedural on paper, but the absence of documented warnings or prior disciplinary steps stood out clearly. Emma looked at the pages but did not touch them. It felt strange seeing her own life reduced to structured lines and bullet points, as if a decision that had changed her entire stability could be explained in such a detached format. William observed her reaction carefully, then asked her a simple question. He asked if she would be willing to return to her position, not under the same management, but within a restructured team that would report through a different supervisory channel. The question caught her off guard. Emma blinked, her first instinct being disbelief rather than excitement. She asked him why he would even consider that for someone he barely knew. William paused before answering, choosing his words carefully. He said that he did not base decisions solely on familiarity, but on observed judgment under pressure, and that her actions earlier that day reflected a level of character that could not be taught in standard evaluations. Emma looked away briefly, trying to process the idea that a single moment in the street had somehow become the center of a professional reassessment at a corporate level she had never imagined being part of. She told him she needed time to think, not because she was ungrateful, but because she did not understand what accepting such an offer would mean for her stability or her son. William nodded immediately, accepting her response without pressure. He told her there was no urgency and that she would not lose the opportunity if she needed time to decide. The absence of insistence surprised her more than the offer itself. As the conversation settled, William shifted slightly and asked her something unexpected. He asked what her life looked like outside of work. Emma hesitated again, then spoke more openly than she had. All day, she told him about her son, about early mornings, about balancing daycare schedules and late shifts, about how every unexpected change in income could turn into a chain reaction of stress within days. She did not dramatize it, but she did not soften it either. William listened without interruption, his expression gradually shifting into something more reflective. When she finished, he leaned back slightly, looking at her not as an employee or a case file, but as a person navigating constant pressure without visible support. After a moment, he told her something that felt less like a proposal and more like a recognition. He said that people like her were often the ones holding things together in ways that went unnoticed until they were no longer there. Emma did not respond immediately. The words were simple, but they landed differently than anything she had heard in a long time. Outside the conference room, the city continued its uninterrupted movement, lights shifting across buildings like a constant reminder of scale and distance. Inside, however, something had quietly changed in the direction of the conversation, not as a dramatic turn, but as a slow acknowledgement that the moment she had chosen to help a stranger had already set something larger into motion than either of them had anticipated. The city outside the conference room windows had begun to shift into its late evening rhythm, where the glow of office towers softened and the streets below became a moving pattern of headlights and reflections. Inside the room, Emma Carter remained seated as if unsure whether she had fully stepped into a different version of reality or was still waiting for the moment everything would snap back to what it had been that morning. William Harris closed the folder gently and placed his hands together on the table, his expression composed but thoughtful. He had already made several internal calls while she had been speaking, confirming details that did not change the core truth of what had happened. Emma had been dismissed abruptly, without proper documentation, after a minor incident that should never have escalated to termination. More importantly, the man she had helped earlier that day had confirmed her actions personally. William understood patterns in business decisions, and this did not follow one. He looked at Emma again, noticing the subtle exhaustion in her posture, the kind that came from sustained pressure rather than a single difficult day. He asked her one more question, whether she would be willing to meet his father in person. Emma blinked, slightly confused by the shift, and asked if that was necessary. William nodded, explaining that his father had specifically asked about her after returning home, describing her presence with more detail than William had initially expected. There was a brief silence before Emma agreed, not out of curiosity, but because something in the situation no longer felt like something she could simply step away from. William stood and gestured for her to follow, leading her out of the conference room and down a private corridor that extended deeper into the building. They passed through a quiet elevator ride that descended several floors, not toward the exit, but toward a more private section of the building reserved for executive residence and family access. Emma noticed the change in atmosphere immediately, the lighting warmer, the spaces less formal, the silence less corporate and more personal. When the elevator doors opened, they entered a refined but understated living space, designed more for comfort than display. Richard Harris was seated near a large window, a book resting loosely in his hands, though his attention shifted the moment they entered. He stood slowly, his movements careful but steady, and for a moment his expression softened as he recognized Emma. There was no formality in his greeting, only a simple acknowledgement of her presence. Emma hesitated slightly, unsure how to address him in a setting so different from where they had met earlier. Richard smiled faintly and told her she did not need to treat him like someone distant or important, which immediately eased some of her tension. William remained near the entrance, observing quietly as the two began to speak. Richard thanked her directly for helping him that morning, not with exaggerated gratitude, but with sincerity that made the moment feel more personal than ceremonial. Emma responded modestly, repeating that it had been nothing more than helping someone cross the street. Richard shook his head gently, saying that in a city like this, even small acts of attention could feel rare. As they spoke, William watched the exchange carefully, noting the way his father responded to her presence, not as someone impressed by status or wealth, but as someone genuinely moved by a simple act of consideration. Richard then said something that shifted the tone of the room slightly. He mentioned that he had spoken briefly with staff at William's company earlier that day and had heard, indirectly, about Emma's dismissal. Emma looked toward William instinctively, surprised that the situation had already reached beyond the cafe and into internal discussions she had no awareness of. William confirmed calmly that he had already reviewed the circumstances and found inconsistencies that needed further attention. Emma felt a mix of uncertainty and disbelief, not because she doubted what they were saying, but because she could not understand why it was receiving this level of attention. Richard then asked her about her life, not in a formal way, but with genuine interest. Emma found herself answering more openly than she expected, describing her son, her routines, and the constant balancing act of maintaining stability while managing unexpected changes. William remained silent, listening, but his attention was clearly focused on the details she shared. When she finished, Richard nodded slowly and said that people often underestimate the weight carried by those who manage responsibility without recognition. The words were simple, but they landed with a quiet depth that made Emma look down for a moment. William finally spoke again, saying that he intended to review the decision made at Horizon Accounting directly and ensure that proper corrections were made. Emma immediately asked what that meant for her personally, and William replied that it meant she would not be left in uncertainty. He told her that she would have options, and more importantly, she would have time to decide without pressure. Emma did not respond right away. She looked between father and son, realizing that what had begun as a single moment of help on a street had expanded into something far larger than she had ever experienced in her life. Outside the window, the city continued to move forward without pause, but inside the room, the trajectory of her life had already begun to shift in ways that were no longer reversible. The evening light outside the residence windows had softened into deep blue, with the city below glowing like a field of scattered stars. Inside the private living space, Emma Carter stood near the edge of the room, still processing everything she had heard, everything she had seen, and everything that seemed to be unfolding far beyond the limits of her ordinary life. Richard Harris had returned to his seat, watching her quietly with a calm expression, while William Harris remained standing near the side of the room, his attention divided between his father and the woman who had unknowingly set all of this in motion. There was no pressure in the room, only a sense of paused movement, as if time itself had slowed to allow decisions to form carefully. Emma finally spoke, her voice measured but uncertain, asking what would happen next if she accepted nothing and simply tried to return to her life as it was before. William looked at her for a moment before answering, telling her honestly that nothing would return to the way it was before, not because of obligation, but because the circumstances had already shifted beyond that point. He explained that her termination would be formally reviewed and corrected, and that her employment record would be restored, but more importantly, she would be given a direct position outside of the structure that had failed her. Emma listened without interrupting, her expression shifting between disbelief and quiet processing, as if each sentence required time to fully land. Richard then added gently that sometimes life changed direction not because of grand decisions, but because someone chose to act when it would have been easier not to. His tone carried no formality, only lived understanding. Emma looked down at her hands, again, feeling the weight of choices she had never expected to face in a single day. She thought about her son at home, sleeping peacefully without knowing that his mother's entire future was being discussed in a room overlooking Manhattan's skyline. William stepped slightly closer to the table and said that he was not offering charity, but rather recognizing value that had already been demonstrated under pressure. Emma looked up at him, still unsure how to interpret that distinction. He continued, explaining that people in structured systems were often evaluated on metrics that did not reflect real character, and that her actions had revealed something those systems failed to measure. There was a pause after he finished speaking, and for the first time since she had entered the building, Emma felt less like she was being evaluated and more like she was being understood. Richard stood slowly, walking toward a side table where a simple folder had been placed earlier. He handed it to Emma without urgency, telling her it contained options rather than instructions. Emma hesitated before taking it, then opened it carefully. Inside were documents outlining potential employment pathways, support structures, and transitional arrangements, all presented in a way that emphasized choice rather than obligation. She closed it again after a few seconds, overwhelmed not by complexity, but by possibility. William observed her reaction and said that she did not need to decide immediately. He told her she could take time, speak with whoever she needed, and return only when she felt certain. Emma nodded slowly, still processing the idea that she was allowed time, something she had not experienced in a long while. Richard then shifted the conversation slightly, asking her about her son again, this time with a soft curiosity rather than formality. Emma responded more openly, describing his personality, his small habits, the way he asked questions that made her laugh even on difficult days. As she spoke, the tension in her voice eased slightly, and the room felt less like a negotiation space and more like a quiet conversation between people who were no longer strangers. William noticed that change and remained silent, allowing it to continue without interruption. When Emma finally finished speaking, there was a brief pause before William said that whatever decision she made, she would not be left unsupported. He clarified that this was not conditional, not dependent on acceptance, but a matter of principle. Emma looked at him for a long moment, trying to understand why someone would extend that kind of certainty without expecting something in return. Outside the windows, the city continued its endless motion, cars moving like lines of light across the avenues. But inside the room, something more stable had formed, not resolution, but alignment. Emma held the folder a little tighter now, not because she had decided, but because she was beginning to understand that her life had already entered a space where old boundaries no longer applied. The night had fully settled over Manhattan by the time Emma Carter stepped out of the building, the air cooler now, carrying the quiet rhythm of a city that never truly slept. She stood for a moment under the glow of the entrance lights, holding the folder tightly against her chest, as if it were the only solid thing left in a world that had shifted too quickly. Behind her, the glass doors closed softly, sealing away the silence of the room where everything had been explained, offered, and left open for her decision. William Harris had walked her to the elevator himself, and Richard Harris had given her a simple nod before she left, a gesture that carried more meaning than words. Now she was outside again, but nothing felt the same as it had just hours before. The street was familiar, yet distant, like a place she had not fully returned to. She walked slowly toward the corner, her thoughts divided between the life she had known and the possibilities she had been shown. Her phone buzzed again, reminding her of ordinary responsibilities waiting for her at home, but even those felt slightly disconnected now, as if they belonged to someone else. Across town, William Harris stood by the window of the same residence, watching the city lights without really seeing them. His father had already retired to another room, leaving him alone with the quiet aftermath of decisions that were still forming. He replayed the day in his mind, not as isolated events, but as a chain of small actions that had led to something unexpected. A moment on a street, a choice made without calculation, and the consequences that had followed. He understood impact in business terms, but this was different. This was personal without being familiar, meaningful without being planned. A message appeared on his phone from his assistant, confirming that the termination at Horizon Accounting had been officially reversed at an administrative level, and that Emma Carter's record was now marked for immediate reinstatement pending her decision. William read it once, then set the phone down without responding. He did not feel satisfaction in the usual sense, only a quiet awareness that something important had been set in motion. Emma arrived home later that night to find her son asleep, his small body curled under a blanket, completely unaware of the weight his mother had been carrying all day. She sat beside him for a long time, watching him breathe steadily, grounding herself in something simple and real. The folder remained on the kitchen table where she had placed it earlier, unopened since she returned. She finally reached for it again, not to decide, but to understand. As she reviewed it more carefully, she noticed not only the structure of opportunity, but the absence of pressure, the way each option was presented without urgency, as if her life was not being redirected but expanded. That realization unsettled her more than fear, because she had grown used to choices being limited, not multiplied. The next morning, William received a short message requesting another meeting, this time on neutral ground, not in an office or residence, but somewhere simple where conversation would not feel weighted by environment. He agreed immediately. They met 2 days later in a quiet public park overlooking the river, a place where the city felt distant despite being close. Emma arrived first, sitting on a bench with the folder beside her. When William approached, there was no formality between them this time, only recognition of shared understanding of what had already happened. Emma told him she had thought carefully and that she was not rejecting the opportunity, but she needed to return to stability for her son before making any major changes. William nodded, accepting her answer without hesitation. He told her that the position would remain available, but more importantly, that support systems would remain in place regardless of timing. Emma looked at him then, not with confusion anymore, but with a clearer sense of the unusual space she had entered, where decisions were not being forced, only offered with patience. She asked him why he was doing all of this for someone he barely knew. William paused for a moment before answering. He said that most decisions he made were based on efficiency, but some moments did not fit that framework, and those were the ones that stayed with him. Emma did not respond immediately. She looked out toward the river, where sunlight reflected softly across moving water, and for the first time since that morning, she felt something closer to calm than uncertainty. Not resolution, not certainty, but the beginning of something that no longer felt like an end.